Before I start, just to gauge a sense of the audience's background, how many of y'all are undergrads? Okay, okay, a couple. Grad students? Okay. Science, technology, engineering majors? Okay. Let's see. Who is from the Hill? Who's a policy or regulator person, a legislator? Nobody. That was a trick question. If there was one, we'd all know. Okay, let's get started. So this panel today is about demystifying AI. We are talking about what AI policy looks like in the near term, 2024. So the panel discussion will be done by these esteemed folks. But let me introduce the topic, how we're thinking about it. So we want to explore the dynamics and patterns of AI policy that we expect in AI policy in the short to medium term. There are two key patterns we might explore today. The first being, we know the United States is a powerhouse when it comes to artificial intelligence. We have many of the largest companies, many of the most innovative companies in this space. And yet when it comes to the regulation of AI technologies and AI relevant technologies like data, we are lagging behind. We tend to be a policy taker as opposed to a policy giver. While the EU tends to have very robust policies and proposals for regulating artificial intelligence. So we are going to discuss whether we expect this dynamic to continue, whether there is anything that we expect to disrupt this dynamic. The second piece will be around industry self-regulation. So as a basically business-first economy in the United States, we sometimes think our artificial intelligence companies should regulate themselves. Do we expect that to work? What can we expect around that? So to help us discuss this, we'll have folks from different backgrounds. Why don't we go down the line and have a short introduction of yourselves? We'll start one and then go all the way down.
My name is Sori Bell. I am an AI policy fellow. You can call me a staffer on Capitol Hill. I work for Senator Cassidy. Before that, I was at Meta and Microsoft. And before that, I was a Foreign Service officer. I worked for State Department for about 10 years.
Hi, everyone. My name is Arthi Garg, and in my day job, I lead science and technology strategy at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, which includes a lot of our AI technology strategy. I also serve in our corporate governance around AI. Some of you folks from NSPN may also know me as the founder of Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally, which is an organization that is whose mission is to get more people with backgrounds in STEM engaged with local government and local community.
Hi, everyone. My name's Evan Geary. I work at Snapchat. We have a formal partnership with OpenAI, and we're one of their biggest partners there. And so I actually don't have a formal policy background. I have a fine arts degree, but I wrote a lot of Snapchat's original content moderation policies and policies for other areas like ads and lenses and things like that. And I work closely with our product team to develop our AI features. So I hope to represent the perspective of somebody who's going to be on the receiving end of any regulation that comes down the pipe. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Russell Wald. I'm the Deputy Director for the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Our acronym, we either go by HAI or HI. And it's Stanford's one of their newer institutes, but we're over 5 years old now. And it's an interdisciplinary institute that looks at artificial intelligence, not just from a technological perspective, but also takes into account the impacts on society and what that's going to mean, and the fact that this is a general purpose technology at this point. It will also consider, we will work with Stanford's medical school, the law school, humanities, arts. AI is no longer just one unique, narrow field of computer science, but it is something that's going to affect everyone. And so therefore, you need a diverse group of stakeholders at the table. I started off as at HAI as the first policy director, so I have a lot to talk about from a policy perspective, and you'll hear me probably consistently come back to a need for public sector investment in artificial intelligence so that it's not just completely located right now within private industry.
All right. So these guys are extremely well qualified to talk about this. Let's start with the first question. It'll be a three-parter. Let's start easy. What is your conception of AI? And I'd like for you to explore what are the benefits you expect from broad deployment of AI. But I also want you to spend some time thinking about what are the negative externalities that come from the use of AI. We'll start with Soribel.
So what is AI? I think that's a little bit of a misnomer. AI is a lot of different technologies. Basically, it tries to mimic human intelligence, but it's more than just AI. There's different types. There's machine learning, there's deep learning, there's generative AI, which is generating new content or past content, but it's generating instead of predicting. So there's a lot of different nuances in that. A technology that uses extensive data and computer science to try to mimic human intelligence. I'm more interested in talking about the promised benefits and also the externalities. I really like that you called it negative externalities because there's a lot of those. In terms of the promised benefits, we have efficiency and productivity. AI promises to turn all of us into, people with superpowers. We can finish things sooner. We can do it with less money. We can do so much with AI. And that's good both for companies because they save money, and it's good for employees because it saves us time and we can be more productive. There is the promised benefit of personalization. We can have our own personalized AI tutor, and our kids can have their own tutor, and you don't have to pay for it. We can have our own health assistant. We can have so much personalized medicine. We can have so much personalized almost anything that you can think of. So that's a huge benefit. That's a huge promise. In terms of downsides, and I don't want to be negative, Nancy, but there's quite a few of those, and I think we should really think about this. There is, just like we can have more productivity, we're also going to need fewer people, fewer workers, and there's going to be a lot of worker displacement. There may be a lot of automation. There can be mass unemployment, and that's something that I don't think we talk about enough. Um, and so we should start thinking about those things and thinking about how we are going to reinforce our safety net, our social safety net, which is not great in this country. How we're going to take these people and retrain them, how we're going to address people that are like in the middle age, 40 something, 50 something, and have to retrain them from scratch. We have to think about data and how, a few companies are now going to have more and more of our data. Like, how much more data can they have? More than you can think of. So we have to think about this negative externalities, and that's no reason to stop progress and to stop, development of AI. But I think those things need to really be addressed.
Thank you, Sorabel. I'm definitely not going to. Sorabel made a lot of great and comprehensive points on each of the three parts of questions that you asked us to answer. And he gave us actually 3 minutes, and I said that was a really unfair amount of time because it was too long to just give a short, high-level answer, but too short to go into all of the nuances. But luckily, I get to build on a great response here. And so I'm mostly going to try to add to it. And so, kind of starting with that question of the complexity around what is AI? Things have been evolving a lot, but I think when kind of colloquially you hear about AI and often what maybe policymakers are most concerned about, we're thinking about mathematical models that can look at very large pieces of data and make inferences. And increasingly, those inferences are based on data that aren't the data you put into it. And so those inferences sound like new stories or new images or generated new content. But in some way, it's just, once again, a prediction of the next word you might expect in a sentence. Based on the data that a model was trained from. And so I think, if we start to think about that's what we're really thinking about right now is this tool that we scientists have been developing this in one way or another for centuries, but something has changed, I think, in the last 10 years or so with the advent of deep learning, where instead of having more interpretable models, statistics-based models, we really moved into a regime where we don't really know why our mathematical, models are interpreting data and drawing inferences the way that they are. And so I think that is a big change, and maybe why we're thinking about policy very differently, even though people have been talking about artificial intelligence for at least 50 to 70 years right now. And, there have been artificial intelligence departments at universities for almost that long. So I think it's important to kind of ground this discussion in what are some of the things that might be new in terms of what we're thinking about right now. And that's a big piece of it. And then adding to that, not only now do we have these models that we don't really understand why they draw the insights that they do from a mathematical perspective, we have this concept of a foundation model. So if you're using ChatGPT, you're using a model that was trained on a bunch of data that I guarantee you have no idea what was in that data set, because that is by design. And so you don't really know what the underlying assumptions are about what kind of the base level population of information is that the model was trained on. So I think from a policy perspective, those are some of the challenges that policymakers face. But, why should we care about this technology aside from the fact that, it's out there and people are using it and it's hard. I mean, if you use Microsoft products at this point, it's embedded in those products. I think, from a benefit standpoint, I think Russell said it really well. AI, because of this concept of foundation models and these, models that are trillions, of parameters. So, well, we're hitting that threshold anyway. But so at least billions of parameters that they become general purpose. So it means that it's really easy now to train. I mean, relatively speaking, to train a model to synthesize scientific research, to synthesize data that you pull from the internet, to synthesize all kinds of things and generate new content or draw insights. And so that means there's a lot of things, to Sorbel's point, you can do that maybe feel like we're becoming, superhuman in our ability to interpret all of these data. You've probably seen these charts of data growing at these exponential rates over the last decade or so. And so now we can make use of all that data we've been storing for the last several decades. But, what are the downsides? I mean, I think we'll hear about many, many of them, including, just how does any new, very powerful technology transform society? There's always going to be some downsides to that. But I also think that I didn't mention, but in the past, I've also worked in nonproliferation. And I think, one of the concerns is that AI is definitely a dual use technology. So, one thing that I think policymakers are also thinking about is that there are benefits to this technologies, but there are also a lot of different ways it can be used intentionally and unintentionally to significant negative effect. And I think that's one of the challenges that we need to be thinking about from the get-go. And we can talk about this more, but for a lot of reasons, the way this technology is being developed, just in terms of who's putting the money in, who's kind of got the cutting edge capability, makes it a very different regulatory regime than, say, nuclear technology, which is an area I've worked in the past.
Thanks. Thank you. So at Snapchat in the early days, there was this aphorism that got kicked around a lot, which was that in the beginning of the telephone, everybody thought it was kind of just a toy or a gimmick, right? And those networks laid the foundation for like society as we know it, right? So we're like building these little toys and thinking, what is like the craziest version of this, right? And so in my world, we worry about fraud and scams. We've already seen people using generative models to create voice imitators, and you get a phone call saying your loved one is like in jail or something in another country and they need to be bailed out and the money needs to go now, right? That's pretty scary. But I think when we talk about benefits, I mean, we're all nerds here, right? Like we read some article about some novel protein that was impossible for a human mind to conceive of, right? That's so cool. Or looking at like astronomy data and finding patterns there. That is so cool to me and so exciting. As far as the negative externalities, I think obviously content authenticity is a big one that we deal with in the social media space, and I could talk about that more. the ways that we might diverge from other platforms. I think watermarking is futile, but we can get into that later. And I think one negative externality that isn't often discussed, but actually some of this research was done here at UC Riverside, was about the enormous water use of the cooling centers for AI, right? And the energy use as well. And this is not like Snapchat's official opinion. It's just, me as a person being like, there's probably a smart way to be conscientious about this and maybe learn some lessons from like the crypto sugar rush when it comes to how we use resources to develop and deploy this technology. Like, for example, a lot of the energy and water input is in the training phase, not necessarily the output phase. And since that isn't necessarily something that needs to be immediate for end users, that could be done in off-peak hours. That was a recommendation in that UC Riverside paper that I read that was good. Just pandering to the audience here just a little bit, if you don't mind. And obviously, letting somebody make a biological weapon in their garage or a nuke or doing cyber attacks, like that stuff's crazy. There are bills in the works in California about that. And I think those are serious risks, but not something I encounter in my day-to-day. Yeah.
Okay, so everyone is kind of, I think, articulated fairly well here. So I'm just going to give a couple of points here. The first part of this is the title of this is Demystifying AI. And I think if you're reading the news right now or you just see the headlines, you hear one of two things. It's going to fix everything or it's going to kill us all. And there's somewhere in the middle here that it's significantly more nuanced of where the benefits are significant, will exponentially advance human productivity and benefit humans. And so a couple of good examples of this, what I'm most excited about, scientific discovery. The things that will come from this and the new knowledge that's being generated by this is significant. So last year, the US had a nuclear fusion breakthrough that we celebrate as a nuclear fusion breakthrough. But the reality is that would not have happened, at least at this point, without the use of AI and ML techniques. So you're going to start hearing a lot about all of these breakthroughs that are happening that you will probably specify specifically to that domain, but it probably would not have happened if you didn't have this advancement of knowledge. I'll give you another example of this. Right now, matrix multiplication, we are able to see that there's actually this increase in this capability of solving matrix multiplication problems, which is a 50-year problem. So essentially you have scientists, mathematicians working on a math problem with the expectation that they're not going to solve it. They're going to leave their work behind for someone to come back and solve it 50 years later after they've passed or something. But it's being solved tomorrow. So because some of this stuff is happening, it's unlocking all of this new knowledge that's going to be significant for humanity. It was mentioned, Evan mentioned slightly about proteins. Well, there's a program called, a model called AlphaFold, which will help us with protein discovery and being able to map out a protein, which could have taken years just to map out one. They're advancing significantly. Why does this matter to you? Well, it can help for targeted drug discovery, help with rare diseases where companies may not even bother to look at a rare disease because they don't see the investment return on that. And you can actually start to target some of these specifically. So the human experience is going to get significantly, in some cases, better because of AI. But as it was talked about, it is a dual use technology, and there are repercussions that can be used in a negative way that have significant concerns for us. Deep fakes, voice cloning, a lot of these things are going to affect our democracy. There's many elections this year that will be worldwide that will be heavily affected by this. So there's a lot of concerns, and we could spend hours just mapping out the concerns. You could also talk about the benefits to education. My grandfather, who just passed recently because of a childhood injury, was illiterate for his entire life. Today, if he had an AI agent tutor that was able to meet him where he was at and match with him specifically, he probably could, over in a few more years, be able to have an agent, a tutor that would work with him so that he could read. The problem with that is from a societal perspective too, though, we have to think about if we always have agent tutors that are meeting us where we're at, we're not developing resiliency in a society. And then we're always going to, you're going to have to function differently in society. So that's not necessarily a nefarious use of this, that's a positive use that could have spillover effects in how we operate as a society. So we're venturing into this new territory that has a lot of pluses and some downsides that are going to come through with this. And in every case, this is a frontier, and we're going to have to work it out together as a society to figure out what are the rules of the roads we will accept. Maybe we'll say generative AI and a lot of these systems have to stop because we're going mad from all the deep fakes and all of the things. Or maybe we just get better at spotting deep fakes or find other kind of policy solutions that will help with that. But nevertheless, we are in a new era and a new phase, and you all look fairly young enough of a generation that's going to help make some of the decisions that are going to be left here with all of this.
Oh, that's a rich response. All right, all right. So part of my thinking in setting this up has been, we think of regulation and policy as trying to minimize negative externalities and sort of maximize positive outcomes of a technology. So I guess the next question here would be, what has the US been doing around regulation? What have they been doing around legislation? So you all have expressed externalities around election security, security risk with non-state actors, data privacy, and stuff around energy and water use. What has the United States done so far? For this question, let's maybe start with Russell.
So if you're referring to past federal legislation, very little that the US has done in this space. There's states that are looking at this and kind of experimenting of what's going on. There are some state laws that are good. There's a complexity here, was talked about earlier, some California laws. There are issues that are very nuanced and difficult. And so we might look at the US and say, oh, they're so behind, but then, and the EU is very ahead in the space. Yes, they are, but there are a lot of issues that are very complex here. And one of them gets into an open source, closed source debate. If we, an open source area means that people can have access to some of this technology and do bad things with it. But an open source area also means we can utilize and learn how to use these in an academic environment. It's probably the bedrock of our digital infrastructure that is able to help us to get where we're at. And if you actually close some of these up and put unique restrictions on liability restrictions, licensing regimes, who's that going to help and who's that going to benefit? Well, frankly, it's going to really help a lot of the large companies because it's going to sequester and make it that exclusive for them to be able to do this type of work. You're going to hurt academia significantly, and you're going to hurt startups because they won't be able to have the resources necessary to do this type of work. So the idea that if someone has a regulation in place right now, that it's the right regulation may not be the case because we are in this kind of zone of where the technology is moving so quickly. Some of these areas might, the US federal government is a one and done place. You never sit there and say they put a law down and say, 2 years later, let's adjust it, because our system does not operate like that. The states can actually help, I think, a little bit, and there are some state possibilities on here. There's one other important thing that I want to talk about that is not a regulatory area, but what I consider a backdoor access or backdoor way of regulating. And that's through using the government's purchasing power, through acquisition and procurement. So the government actually has a lot of power because they can set standards of the rules of the road and say, we will purchase this said technology off of you and use this in our own systems, but you must meet these benchmarks in this framework and under this criteria, or we will not purchase. You can create a competitive market in this space to force some of these companies to say, we want access to that powerful purchasing capabilities of the federal government or some large, powerful states to be able to do this. And when you do that, that might be a more effective way you can consistently update some of these frameworks as some of these things change. So I'm not trying to say I'm anti-regulation. I'm very for regulation. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit more, but there is concern of a pipeline of regulators. How many people really can go into this space right now? Because if Netflix is offering $1 million salary for some of these people, and we're talking about Netflix, you're not talking about equity and all these other packages, there's not enough people that could actually go in and that's the dirty secret. We keep talking about regulation. Even if the US came up with the optimal regulations tomorrow that held industry's feet to the fire, but still let them innovate, you don't have a talent pipeline that understands this well enough to go in and resource it. So you're going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time. Have public sector investment to be able to train the next generation, use acquisition and procurement, and then find certain high-risk areas that you definitely want to regulate. And in areas of crime, you want to come down as hard as possible. You really want, and voice cloning, anything where it's used for purposes of crime, you want to make sure that the punishment is so severe and significant that it's a deterrent mechanism from there.
So you went straight into meta regulation and
That's right.
meta policy. Sorry, Bill, did you have a point you wanted to add to this?
I work in Congress, and I'm not here to representing Congress. I'm in my personal capacity, but I do have to say that I just like to push back a little on the question. In the absence of federal regulation, there is actually federal regulation. Existing federal regulation regulates AI and oversees AI. And if you break the law in terms of doing some crazy algorithm that hurts people, um, you will face consequences. And we've seen it already. We have FTC that, is enforcing, very assertive FTC in this administration is it's enforcing rules, and it's fining people, and it's companies that, get out of line. And it's doing the job. We have one more. There's antitrust, but there's also the EEOC, for example, that found out there's I think there was an international company that was excluding people over a certain age from job applications, from job interviews, and that company has been fined. So there is not like there is no regulation at all. There is, and you better know what the regulations are.
Okay, from what you're saying, it sounds like you're suggesting that existing regulation that may not be AI specific can still have implications for how AI systems are regulated right now. Okay, cool. Just making sure I'm hearing it correctly. Do you, and this is maybe off the pist, and maybe it's an open question for the panel. Do we expect that pattern to address any AI specific negative externalities? Can we always rely on existing law that may not have been AI specific to be able to control the effect of AI, broadly speaking, nowadays? It's an open question, not on the list, but if anybody has an idea. Let's start with RT and then.
Here, I'll use this mic. Actually, though, I want to kind of first speak to the previous question because I think there's a certain relevance here because we were talking about policy from a regulatory standpoint, but there's a lot of other ways that policy can be used as well. And so I'm going to, at the risk of disagreeing with the former policy director of HI, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit, Russell, and say in some ways the federal government has done a lot in AI, and they've done it through R&D investments. And the advanced computing systems that make sort of the large language models and the generative, the multimodal models and these very, very, very large models that we have become synonymous with what we think of with AI, even though AI is kind of broader than that. Today, all of the sort of even through mission focused work in the intelligence community, for example, we laid a lot of the foundations for capabilities that are being advanced or leveraged in other ways now. So I think, and that's kind of ongoing. I mean, we continue to have investments in R&D at universities, different types of ways that we provide tax credits for R&D investments as well. So there, and I think this goes back to the US often trying to promote technology compared to some other governments that are maybe, start with how do we regulate technologies and, focus more on the downsides of them, whereas we're often trying to regulate technologies or apply technology policy in a way that advances technologies. And I think, though, one of the places we're seeing this play out really in a really interesting way is with self-driving cars, right now. And the questions of who's responsible when a self-driving car gets into an accident, and it's actually the court systems that are adjudicating a lot of these areas where, we do have concepts of who's at fault and what risks people might be assuming and things like that. And we're starting to see, well, whose fault is it when certain algorithms, certain AI systems, because at this point there's a lot of things that are baked into a car that's self-driving, including the sensor networks, for example. Who's at fault there? Historically, we have some models for when the automaker, for example, is at fault for other technology, potentially not working if your brake systems don't work. But now we're in a new regime of technology that isn't just sort of mechanical technology that it's easy to trace back fault from. So I just point that out where we have that, but it's not straightforward. It's not easy to interpret rules that already exist in the context of technology that functions in a very different way and is even designed in a very different way than we're used to technology being designed and manufactured.
By way of analogy, when we were developing some machine learning lenses, those filters that change your face, one of the early ones was like an anime lens. And we found that it kind of only worked on like white people or Asian people, right? And so we put a lot of work in to go back to the training data and correct for biases, right? But through that process, it's like, oof, what if that was being used in law enforcement surveillance, right? And they didn't have the resources to correct that. That's terrible, right? What if that was used in employment, right? Like Sorbo mentioned, like that's terrible. And so I think I as like a citizen and whatever welcome regulation in those areas where it's going to affect people's lives. I think that there is a bill in the works in California that addresses this topic. But really what I've seen from state lawmakers is interest in content authenticity. And I think this is a symptom of, with Section 230, social media companies are not technically liable for the content that their users publish, right? That has been the status quo for so long. It's affected elections a little bit, right? And so now the people whose careers as elected officials are affected are like, well, we don't want to be caught on the back foot the next time. And every general is always fighting the last war. And so they're really interested in generative AI technologies and how they affect elections. But I think to echo another point made before, we do have existing laws or best practices about some of this stuff, right? Like the whole thing with the royal family. I don't know if anybody noticed all all that stuff. Was that made with AI or was that made with Photoshop? I don't know, right? And like that's important to put our feet down and say, like, we should have expectations of being able to understand the provenance of content, whether it's made with AI or not. Because in practical matters, like there are certain bills that are asking us to detect if something was made with AI or to have a persistent watermark. And maybe we could do an industry standard, but somebody could fake it right away, right? And so having our platforms designed with architecture that has some hurdles in place for moderation is at the forefront of my mind. Absolutely.
I want to build on a little bit of what was talked about here because I think that there is alignment on a lot of stuff in terms of the fact that indeed, for me personally, there are a lot of existing regulations that can easily be enforced and should be enforced. And in fact, we've actually done studies where we looked at this and saw it's actually where some regulations are really specific, but in each domain, or let's just say agency in this case, they actually have a lot of applicability in this. But nevertheless, we are going to have to rethink how we look at regulation differently in an age of AI. And I'm going to give you this anecdote as to why to help feed your mind a little bit here on this. The 1974 Privacy Act is an act that was put into place for a lot of reasons, but one reason is people of color were denied banking loans in the past. So what did we do? We went and actually said to banks, we limited the amount of racial data that they can collect. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, today, banks are actually using these systems to underwrite credit. And we know that these systems actually have a disproportionate outcome of where they will affect people of color in a negative way. But the banks cannot collect the racial data to audit their own systems. So think about this. We actually have a law that we thought was put in place for a benevolent reason in 1974. But because of today, in the age of AI, you now have a perverse situation of where you cannot collect the data to actually audit the system, where you might be re-entrenching racism pre-1974 in our banking system. This requires, so every current regulation is what we refer to as the regulatory alignment problem. This is where if you think of, if you do not actually look at every law and how it affects in an age of an AI, it's significantly different. Because you could sit here and say, we have the 1974 Privacy Act to protects all of these things, and it's wonderful and it's great. But in the age of AI, it's actually could be a problem. So all of our regulations, all of our things need to be relooked at and thought in a different way and brought up to speed to where we are today, not where we were in 1974.
Really great. Let's see. We keep going down this path on meta policy, even though it's one of the last questions on the list. So might as well just jump into it. So as Russell has pointed out, old regulations may not be sufficient to address the externalities that come up with AI. The other aspect of this is something that's come up already, the speed with which AI is evolving and how that might be outpacing our ability to legislate or regulate effectively. So can we build on that? Do we have any ideas for philosophies, approaches, good ideas for regulating in this brave new world? Maybe Russell, you want to take that again?
I don't want to get too much. We can get into certain regulations, but to stick in that meta area, one thing that I'm more interested in is setting up infrastructure to make it easier for us to regulate. So one thing that I think for that, if you're looking at it, let's just say in a US federal perspective, what would be useful is an NTSB, a National Transportation Safety Board. So anytime there's any kind of major incident that happens, everything, let's use planes for an example here. There's a screw like that came off of an Alaska jet, which I'm about to fly home on shortly. But there's a screw, and but what happened was is NTSB then works with FAA, and they force now a review of every little screw, and they go and tighten the bolt here on this. So if you think about it from this way, what is the an important way that we can actually set ourselves up for proper regulation is incident reporting and allow for incident reporting to actually be more effective in this case. So you use ChatGPT and there's all of these consistent problems that you start to find, and you can actually have incident reporting because it has adverse effects. What would happen in that case is you would, if you started to see enough collection of something, you say there's a problem here, and you can force some type of algorithmic review or an auditing system in this particular case. Again, coming back to the pipeline also, one other option is to create a market-based regulatory system like we do in accounting firms, of where there is a government system because of Enron and what happened in 2004, I believe. Now there's review of accountants, and the accounting agency has to submit to government review in this space. But the accounting agency works now with industries to make sure that they are compliant in that space. So there's a bridge between that, and that might actually help us shore up that talent that we need in this space.
Anybody else have thoughts on better regulation in this age?
I'll share maybe a related thought. That's not so much regulation, but going back to sort of your question around philosophy and sort of, this sort of sense of, well, what can we possibly do? And, I'll say that I'm a physicist by training, and I often joke that that it's very important to fund physics departments, because otherwise physicists go out into the real world and we destroy it. We make, we make nuclear weapons. We were kind of responsible for a lot of the mathematics that led to sort of the 2008, some of those weird financial products that led to the, yeah, the economic collapse in 2008. And, a lot of physicists are actually behind the development of a number of the sort of modern approach to AI, which is heavily dependent on these sort of very large, many parameter matrix based and transformer based mathematically AI models. And so I think one of the things, though, that the reason I make that point is that some of it also has to go back to what do we think we need to instill as responsibility within kind of the people that make these technologies, because these technologies are evolving very fast. And so I think, like Evan's role is really important at a lot of companies. And, I've worked or I've taken courses around AI ethics with other people from other corporations. And it's very interesting to see how in a lot of corporations, AI ethics is kind of a corporate function that lives very outside of the sort of product and engineering capability, and in other places it's much more ingrained. And I think that, for example, can lead to very different outcomes in terms of how technologies are developed. I have a lot of engineers come to me and say, I feel like no one really understands what you can do with this technology as well as I do because I'm making it. And so I need to be more involved in decisions about what we actually decide to do as a company with this technology, because no one else can understand it as well as I can. And so I think it's a different approach, but it's something that I don't necessarily seeing being emphasized enough at the level when people are being trained, and then going beyond that to even the development structure and how much do you ingrain these types of safeguards into the development of technology versus viewing it as something that comes after. Anyone else?
Well, I would just pose a totally different point, and that would be attracting top talent to government, both on the Hill and in our agencies, our federal agencies, because there's this gap, like you mentioned. You're either going to the private sector and becoming a millionaire in a year, or you're going to government and you're going to live a very modest middle class. You're having a really modest lower middle class lifestyle. But I think there has to be more like of an awakening in the American public, and have more civic mindedness, and say, look, I want to go into government and I want to make sure that AI benefits everyone and that it's good for humanity, and I'm going to go work for FTC and put my degree to use. And I think having more attracting more tap and technical talent, but also policy and all kinds of talent to government, so that they can go in and kind of stand up to the big tech, people that come in and throw and then say that. I'm sorry. I'm not looking at him. I'm just saying, like, we need more top talent in government so that we can because a lot of people say, well, government is too slow, they will never understand. Let us do what we do and forget it. You'll be fine. Don't worry, trust us. That doesn't work anymore. We need to have equally competent people in government.
Let's do Evan first and then Russell.
Yeah, I made the point earlier about big companies creating a bit of a moat around themselves with regulation. And I would say at Snapchat, that is the position that we find ourselves in, where we are often fighting against to surmount the moat of big regulation. So we kind of skipped over the EU Brussels effect part. And I just want to say, I was very involved in the DSA process at Snapchat, and I found it very collaborative. There was a constant back and forth of is this actually feasible for you, right, to implement some of this stuff? Because sometimes the policymakers don't understand why something is difficult or crazy expensive. One little thing that seems very sensible might not work, right? And so having that sort of collaborative back and forth, I think, is really valuable. And I think marshaling all of the underdogs, right, to say what is actually fair and what would be fair for a startup as well. We don't want Google and Microsoft and a few others to just run the world forever, right? Yeah, that's all.
Do you agree with that?
I want to build on Sorbel's point because I couldn't agree more that we need a better pipeline of people going in to government. We ourselves at Stanford University have tried to set up a variety of programs, and indeed some that have inspired technical students, not policy students, technical students to unveil for them that there is a pathway for public service and to be engaged and involved. We've created entire fellowship programs and all of this. But what is really important is government needs to find a way to attract people, and we know they will not attract them by salary. Public service is, there's a reason it's public service, and we know that they will not get that level of salary. And I think a lot of people are okay with that. The issue is are we giving them the tools and infrastructure needed? And I can tell you right now, we have sent sophisticated, smart students into government, and they couldn't get access to even one GPU. A graphics processing unit, we estimate right now, I think you could say ChatGPT, there's rumors back and forth, but at a minimum, we know it was over 10,000 GPUs to train, and that's at a minimum on ChatGPT. So if you can't have access to any of this, how can you stay fresh, learn? How can you use some of this technology for public good use? So using it in the Veterans Administration to be able to, it takes 3 years to adjudicate a claim in the Veterans Administration. And for some people, 3 years to get the benefits you need is a death sentence. So how is that we can make government more efficient for people and to be able to do that? Well, we can't do that if we can't even supply one GPU to somebody in government. So we have to be able to provide the resources for people to want to come into government and participate in the system, because we know we're not going to pay them what they could make on the market, but they know that they could make a difference in public service, but they can't make a difference in public service if they don't have the tools.
This is a tough point. It's hard to, I'm imagining it's hard to take a society that's gone through the pull yourself up by the bootstrap, make as much money as possible, and then ask the people who are recipients of this culture to now turn around and become more civic minded. But y'all are the generation and the next generation coming up, so maybe you guys have other thoughts on this. I'll take a moderator's privilege here to respond to RT's comment earlier on responsible AI and integration into product. So I did introduce myself. I currently work at LinkedIn in the responsible AI group. LinkedIn's responsible AI program is interesting because it's forced to integrate deeply with product. And I can tell you from first-hand experience, it is a pain. It is like taking philosophical ideas and saying, okay, this is how it should work, and then actually translating into practice it's been humbling. Let's just put it that way. But yeah, that's the last point I'll make on that. I think we'll be remiss if we didn't spend quite a lot of time talking about the key policy driver in the space right now, which is EU. So let's move out from the United States perspective and go to the international perspective. What kinds of regulations are we seeing there? Evan talked about DSA. I think we also have DMA and the AI Act. What can we expect to be the impact of these types of regulations? Maybe we start with Evan and then we go RT and then Soribel.
A lot of these EU bills are, at least in my experience from a social media platform company, they're concerned with, again, the authenticity issue in AI, the ways that algorithms serve content to people, addiction. Those are probably some of the main issues that we've looked at. I don't really know if I have a ton to say about AI and EU regulation because some of that stuff is still ongoing. Yeah.
I'll take this one. Although I think I would also like to hear what Russell has to say, because I know Hai has actually published some work on how the EU Act would potentially impact some of the model producers in the EU. I think, kind of to Evan's point, right now from a regulatory standpoint, HPE, where I work, we sell infrastructure and services to customers who use AI primarily. And so we're still kind of working out. And I think a lot of this is sort of working out exactly how this affects us. Some of this is we're affected from a procurement standpoint. People need to buy things that work in a certain way. There's sovereignty issues right now that actually probably affects us more than, because a lot of the AI regulations are still kind of coming into play. A lot of a lot of concerns about data center sustainability. So this kind of goes back to what Evan was talking about with respect to the use of water. That's also one of kind of my areas of focus is sustainable AI, and so those are areas that maybe aren't on the technology itself, but the enabling technology, and so I think a lot of this is, remains to be seen. As certain laws like GDPR have matured, it's a lot easier to know how that's going to affect what people are doing. And I think the same thing is likely to happen with the AI aspects of it that maybe affect models themselves as well.
I worked on DSA when I was at Meta. Oh, yeah, that's the Digital Services Act, and it kind of regulates social media platforms. We don't know more because it's very social media focused, but I can already tell you that the DSA, it's social media focused law, has already had a Brussels effect on the US, because a lot of the bills that I see floating around, whether or not they pass, they have a lot of those same some of the same principles. Things like targeted advertising to minors, algorithms targeted to kids, and addictive features. So it's already had a Brussels effect. In terms of the EU AI Act, time will tell. I think, not every country's racing to pass its own EU AI Act, because they understand that maybe the EU got ahead of itself. Maybe that will kind of not disrupt, but kind of deter innovation. Maybe some of their own startups will leave the EU, maybe come to the US. I don't think anyone is trying to, you know, run behind the EU. Um, that said, I there's quite a, almost every country is trying to pass its own AI governance framework. The United States is doing a good job too. I have to say, as someone who works on the Hill, there's a lot of attention, energy, time, resources spent on making sure that we have our own governance framework. But will it be the same as the EU AI Act? I don't know.
So I think just at the beginning of this, we asked a couple of questions on where this audience stands. So just to elevate a little bit, so we're talking about the Brussels effect. Essentially, what the EU has is market share power and the ability through its purchasing power to help set the rules of the road. That's essentially what the Brussels effect is. And in fact, it's been significant on the tech industry because most tech platforms or companies, their legal departments actually will just structure based on EU law because it's the most stringent, and then it's interoperable. I can say the word right now. Everyone knows what I mean. And so it's easier just to have your legal departments operate under that way of thinking. So that's the important effect that can happen from the EU in this space. But the EU is facing a bit of a conundrum here. How far do they want to go, and what is the effect on their own indigenous companies and their own native companies in this space? And this is a significant challenge for them. We actually did benchmark based off of the EU, the parliamentarian version of the EU AI Act last year. We benchmarked all of the requirements for foundation model providers. And we were able to go and benchmark them, and we had a couple of unique insights. One, all foundation model providers, whether that's Google, whether that's Hugging Face, whether it was OpenAI, they all failed. They would have all failed under the EU, that version at that time would have failed under that. So that sent a message to the foundation model providers: you will have a limited amount of time to get in compliance with this should it come into effect. The second thing, though, and what was really important, was a message back to the EU, and it was the only single European foundation model provider we could benchmark that we would qualify as a foundation model provider was the worst performing one of all on their own stuff. So how much do you want to be a regulator and how much do you want to be an innovator is this kind of fine walk everyone's consistently walking. Because if regulation were easy here, we would have slapped it on and called it a day and said no big deal.
there's a reason why the US hasn't, beyond its own. The US system is very slow and does not seem to be in a mood for working together to find common ground. But nevertheless, the systems are not easy to regulate because everyone wants to actually advance on the system as well and innovate with them and not hurt their own innovative base. And you actually saw at the end of the EU AI Act a lot of final last-minute negotiations, particularly from the French, which has a company called Mistral, and they were very concerned about Mistral, and there is just a lot of back and forth here that's happening. And as these systems continually change and update and advance, is the EU going to have to come back again and regulate again in this space because they missed something that was not open or we understood at that time?
And then we'll go to audience. So please have your questions ready.
There may be a limit. This will conform to the Brussels effect here, because I think that the state attorneys general have just wildly different. I see wildly different requests from them. Right? We have conservative state attorneys general who are saying, like, I don't think minors should ever see anything about sex or gender, right, or sexuality. I don't think they should ever see anything about America's history. Right. And then you have more left-leaning attorneys general who are saying you need to remove more hate speech and false information that half this country thinks is not false. Right. And so I think that intransigence, right, intractability is reflected in Congress as well. And it's a bit of a brake effect on how quickly the US conforms to European Union regulations.
New dynamic I hadn't expected. Lovely in quotes. New dynamic I hadn't expected. The effect of diversity in state regulations and countering the Brussels effect. That's interesting. Okay. One last question for you, Evan. What corporate policies are you seeing regarding responsible AI development? Is that something that Snapchat has? Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Say, first of all, I think that we all, like, we weren't starting from zero, as was mentioned previously. There are decades of like research and policy development here that we could borrow from. And even internally, we had certain processes for developing, fairness in lenses and filters and in ad targeting. One of our ad reviewers escalated to me that they found some advertiser that was flouting our policy against targeting for housing credit employment to certain genders and ages and everything, because they had found proxies for some of those things that they were using. And so that just gets easier with AI as well. So internally, we do have teams that are dedicated to machine learning fairness in how we may deploy that in content ranking and content moderation, and also in the generative products that we develop. So I work very closely with our product team, like every day, or they're like, what if we, and they have some idea, and I think what's fascinating with working with AI features is that it feels to me in our fine tuning that it's more like sorcery than coding, because we literally just instruct the model in text what we want it to do. So we're making our own customizations on top of ChatGPT or other models, right? And so one time we said, like, we found the tone was too formal. We wanted it to be more colloquial. And so we said, act more like a real friend. And then we started finding out that it was telling people, like, of course I'm real. My dad is a dentist, my mom's an accountant, and I'll meet you at the Chili's right near you today. Because we have your map location data if you turn that on. So here's a fun place for us to meet in person. And kids were like, no way, and making like Snapchat videos and TikToks about like trying to go meet their AI at Chili's. And so like that's very fun to like make those adjustments. But because things blow up on us, right? It just makes good business sense for the policy team to be very closely aligned there. I can imagine, though, there's often this tension of like, it's always about revenue, right? It's always about revenue. And so I have to make a case that is revenue focused. I have to say there is a risk that if we do this, you're going to lose the trust of segments of our community or incur the wrath of regulators, right? And so we have to kind of internally represent a lot of different stakeholders to the product team. That's very creative.
The one thing I took from your discussion there was AI engineers as sorcerers, all that experience with D&D in the past about word spells. Just kidding. uh, okay, I'll ask the controversial question. Well, in your case, it seems like it's actually meaningful. These policies are meaningful. But oftentimes in the public, when we talk about responsible AI within commercial entities, they think of it as a virtue signaling as opposed to actual things. Does anybody disagree or agree with this perspective? Russell?
I want to say it's one thing to continually say issue spot something. I think it's important to say what is the level of frameworks that you have, and this can be applied in industry, and this can be applied in academia. And to give you an example of this, within Stanford University, we're a grant-making organization, so we will give out money towards unique projects. It can be as low as $75,000 to up to $2.5 million, depending on how complex the project is. And in that case, what we do is we have a requirement that we came up with, which is an ethics and society review statement. So think of it, I think a lot of people raised their hands in here that said they're grad students, so I don't need to explain what an IRB is, but think of it like an extra layer to an IRB, except you're not doing human test subjects. In this case, you're just doing any type of a project. And in it, it requires you to ask, what is the dual use consequences for this? What you go up before a committee and they review what your project is. And there's a lot of questions that are asked about that you might not have thought about. I've been on the receiving end of this, and it is not a simple checklist. They actually asked really complex questions of us, and we didn't even think about this. It was great to have somebody review our work before we even got started. And that's really fundamental for when you're thinking about this. What is your frameworks that you are applying in this case so that you can work towards a more responsible system versus building it just because you said you could or you were interested and you only looked at it from one lane versus multiple lanes and having people poke holes in what you do before you get started. So it's not an audit after the fact or understanding it after it's too late. It's before you even started the research. You were pressed about what that research is, what it's not just dual use, but multi-use implications could be. Do you want to go down that road? If there are multi-use implications or negative implications that could come from it, how are you mitigating for those negative implications? It's really an important part to understand that. So it's not like you're just, oh, here's a problem here, we'll fix it, we'll fix it, we'll fix it. It's at least the very beginning, we have frameworks that are going to guide us through this process to even get there.
I like that. Taking seriously the role of an AI engineer or AI product person as doing an experiment, a human subject experiment, and applying IRB principles to that. Makes a lot of sense. We are out of time for the panel, but we have questions. Oh, crud. How do you want to do this? Okay. Yeah. Let's start with the man standing. He's been standing throughout. Sure.
Thank you. So Russell, at the beginning you said it's, I got the sense that it's good that we haven't tried to come up with AI specific regulation at the federal level right away, that because it's a one-shot deal, it would in some ways be good to wait. My question is, what should organizations be doing to prepare ideas, to contribute to that, to advocate for ideas? What should we be doing to prepare for a possible future regulation? This question feels a little too general to me, so if you can help me specify it a little too. Who should be doing this kind of work and how might they do it?
Okay, sure.
Okay, I'm happy to start then. Okay. So, my ethos from the standpoint of people with backgrounds in STEM engaging in civic life is everyone should do it. It is actually a responsibility. It's not just a nice to have. I think for a handful of people that are interested, I think, one of the questions that you're really asking, I think, though, is how? How do I get engaged? And I think at the federal level, it can be a little bit more challenging than maybe at the state or even local level. And I will say state and local governments are also looking at AI policy, both from how do they encourage its use and then often how they adopt it. And some of the more consequential laws might actually be at the state and even at the local level. with that regard. So right now, there are a number of processes that are underway in the follow-up to the executive order that President Biden published at the end of last year. That directed a number. I think almost every agency had some responsibility. Department of Commerce had a lot of responsibility. So there are. I luckily I don't have to track them. My government affairs team tracks them, and they just pull me in when they need me. But there are a number of kind of open comment processes underway right now around the implementation of that executive order. I think, not knowing anyone's background, but your professional societies, whether there are if you're in industry, whether there are other industry groups that have ways that they engage on these policy topics. As you get closer to home, it can be easier to interact, I think, as an individual. Many states are considering legislation that might, for example, put restrictions on how government agencies can use AI or put requirements on government agencies to adopt AI. So those things are happening at the municipal level, and this is particularly true in the United States. I think a lot of police departments are being marketed or being presented with technology, drone technology, facial recognition technology, all kinds of technologies, many of which are based on computer vision, and they're making decisions on how to use these technologies. These are things you can probably just go and, there are formal mechanisms to engage at the municipal level, but depending on how large the city is, you can often just be interested and talk to your city council, talk to your police chief, and these are things where if you have some expertise, and you don't have to be, I would say, an AI technologist to potentially understand the implications of this technology better than someone with no technical background at all, to have potentially really consequential influence right now, because these procurement decisions can have long tails.
I think it's really important, and Arthi said this, and I think it's really clear that what we need to do here is it's a multi-stakeholder approach. We all are citizens and have a responsibility here to be involved in this. And we can't exclusively put it on the policymaker to have the burden of carrying everything without the citizenry involved. But what that requires is us to be informed and properly informed. And I was telling this Arthi in the back that what for me 2023 was not the year that the public became more of AI. It was for me 2023 was the year that the policymaker became captivated by product AI, and that's a very very dangerous place for us to be, because then you're only hearing from one group of people, and they have a unique set of interest in this space. So I'll give you a quick anecdote here. There was a senator who pulled me aside at right before a hearing was about to start, and he said, so and so showed me with the llama model from Meta, which the weights are available. Not the whole thing is not open. The weights are available. He said that someone was able to get the recipe of anthrax off of this for $800. Turns out we actually did some similar work, and we got it for free off of Wikipedia and Google. Do you have an AI problem here or an internet problem here? There's hysteria that's getting whipped up in people, and that's not grounded in truth or facts. We actually are starting to see some of the biorisk stuff that was talked about 9 months ago with such extraordinary hysteria is by far more difficult than people realize is the case here. Not saying maybe 5, 6, 7 years from now it couldn't become more of an issue. I'm not saying let's ignore it, but again, do we have an internet problem or an AI problem? And if you're going to start regulating and say, oh, we should fix that, what were the downstream impacts of that regulation on that case, in that particular case, would have been actually more disadvantage, hurt academia more, hurt startups more, and not fixed a bio threat that they were talking about. So my bigger concern here is people not being informed in these conversations, and this is a difficult space. So try to be as informed and rooted as possible in this and be good citizens and now participate at the local level or contact your local your member of Congress, engage with their offices, talk about this. There's tons of constituents who federal offices or need to be responsive to, and I think that's an important area.
Thank you for this panel. I really am inspired hearing a lot of this firsthand experience with it. So, as a physicist who is interested in ethics, like to speak up for all of it, we do exist. We are really, a lot of my work is in astronomical data and compiling big data sets and completing synthesis of large data sets to pick out models and empirical relationships. So I was wondering, this is a question to everyone. How do you see the role of a data analyst or a data scientist evolving as AI evolves?
I mean, you still have to like check your work, right? And a lot of these models, as was mentioned, are a bit of a black box. You can't always confirm how they arrived at their conclusions. And so there's already a crisis of reproducibility in science, right? In general, somebody's going to need a human to understand what those patterns are that emerge. So I think it can help shine a flashlight a little farther down the hall, but you still need to walk down the hall yourself at some point. So that's, yeah.
Physics, it's actually astrophysics. So I say I was a data scientist before the term existed because I'm old. Also, so I think what's interesting is that I actually was a little skeptical initially, kind of before the chat GPT craze, of how much generative AI would take off, just because I'm used to coming from a paradigm where ultimately for kind of high value problems, people do data analysis because somehow the model will help them interpret something. So in physics, we're often looking for a model that mimics a law of physics, for example. That's really different, of course, with generative AI, because I think what happens is the answers are very truthy. So people stop caring that they don't understand how they got there. But I think within the sciences, usually you're leveraging any technology for a reason. So, I mean, even if we're talking about something like AlphaFold, it's putting out proteins, but then you'll go test them. Eventually, you're not going to just say this protein, can be used for this type of, sort of advanced precision medicine application until you actually go through a full kind of clinical process of testing it. So, I think that within places where you're designing experiments that leverage AI, I would think there would be a natural check. I think where it becomes an open question is where you're generating answers and there is no real ground truth that you're trying to test it against. And so I guess then the question will become, you know, are we going to still call them data scientists? I don't know. But are there the people who actually develop the new technologies, the new models themselves, people who leverage them, consume them, and in some cases where they're using them for kind of controlled reasons as opposed to just like getting answers, and maybe they'll have different names. I don't know. Data scientist hasn't been around that long either.
Hello. One thing I wanted to ask about is one problem that was briefly touched about, but not so much as in the worries of like fake voice or deepfake such. It's about data collection itself. I mean, even before the greater public concern about generative AI in recent years, data privacy and how companies can access from our data has been a long time concern. And while some states have made efforts in their own laws to address this, and while there's some national policy or this, I don't know if this, I guess, gets the point of whether our laws we make at the federal level are sufficient for protecting consumer interests and everyday citizen interests. So how do you think regulation laws, federally or otherwise, is going in protecting ethically sourced data? Um, in respect to consumer privacy, consent, etc.
Yeah, to make it more specific, I would say that a person's likeness, like, you know, actors being scanned and then having their likeness used in perpetuity as a character in the background of a show, right? Like that kind of stuff. I think I've seen a little bit of legislation about that. I think we need to get really specific when we talk about privacy, because I think that a lot of people just like scroll past the terms and terms and conditions and just click accept. And I don't know if that's like we've seen other legislation about like the right to delete your data or something. I just think that the cat's out of the bag, and not only is the cat out of the bag, but like so many people already assume that or expect companies and services to know so much about them, and you get a little annoyed when like Amazon doesn't remember the kind of toilet paper you ordered last time or something. And so I think we live in this world that we've like gone so far into surveillance capitalism, right? That I honestly do not know how we go back to any semblance of the kind of privacy that people had even like 10, 20 years ago.
I would just add, there are a few bills out there. The Commerce Committee just allowed a bill to go to the floor or introduce a bill, the chair of the Senate committee, and that's huge. If the chair of the Committee of Commerce introduce data privacy bill, comprehensive data privacy bill, I think that's a huge step forward. So is it going to pass? I don't know, but I think that she introduces, it's a big deal. And the thing is, without comprehensive data privacy legislation, we can't have AI regulations. So I think this is a good first step. And there's also other privacy bills that address children specifically and teens. So I think we're in a good place right now compared to even a few months ago.
See a question. Oh, of course.
Thank you so much. I've learned so much and I have so many thoughts, and I'm not going to interject any of my thoughts. I'm going to ask you in like the 1 minute that we have left. There are so many policy opportunities, and we have no idea what our early career fellows and scholars want to do in their life. Do you have maybe a last tip that each of you guys can share about how to engage more fully as they venture from their early career fully into their career? What can they do to be you guys working on these policy issues when we grow up? Dr. Oso.
Oh, I guess I'll start. My background is I was a RAND researcher with Tipring back in the day for 7.5 years, and then went into tech. I was trained as an engineer. I think the path I would suggest for people still coming out of their early careers is get good at your stuff. Whatever you're doing, get really good at it. And part of typically what you're trained for in college or grad school is to think carefully, respond critically, and understand the different nuances of a problem. Every policy issue is going to require those skills: critical thinking, being able to understand different perspectives, being able to integrate both the STEM aspect and the humanistic aspect. What do we care about as humans, as a society? If you're able to balance those types of technical skills with that type of responsible civic mindedness, I think an opportunity will come up. There's always a place for you to play a role. I'll just leave it at that level of abstraction.
So I'm going to say two platitudes and a long answer. The first platitude is there is a space for everyone in AI. The second platitude is ask for forgiveness, not for permission. And the long answer is, so I'm not an engineer. I started my career in diplomacy. I used to work for the State Department. I'm a policy person. I have, by most standards, I have no business being here. But I'm here because I took an interest in AI. I worked on that when I was at Meta for a little bit, but I'm still not a technical person. But I became interested in it. I didn't ask anyone for permission. I started studying on my own. I started posting on my own on LinkedIn. And I started, networking and doing my own thing without asking for permission from anyone. So, in this nascent field like AI, I think everyone can contribute to it. You don't have to be a technical person, and don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong here because you don't understand, because you can't code, or because you don't understand the technology. So yeah, if you're interested in something, go for it. You don't have to ask for permission for anyone. So I'll leave it at that.
So first, I'll second both pieces, or I guess you had three. Sorry about, but the advice that you've already heard. I'll keep it short, and I'll share the best piece of advice I ever received. Career advice, which isn't AI specific at all, but I'll credit to it was actually from Bruce Alberts, who very famous biologist and also former president of the National Academy of Science. And what he said to me when I was graduating from graduate school and trying to figure out what I wanted to do next is he said, "You've got a couple of really interesting opportunities in front of you. My only advice to you is pick the one that's most interesting to you today. Don't worry about where it's going to take you 5 years from now." So especially at your career stage, that's what I would say. I'm pretty shocked at what certain decisions I made that maybe how they affected, even where I am today, going to go work at, nuclear security lab is actually how I wouldn't have the job I have today if it weren't for that. So
I'm not saying it's a good movie, but there's a scene in Justice League where the Flash is like new to the Justice League, and he's like, "Batman, what do I do?" And Batman's like, "Don't get overwhelmed. Just save one person, and then save another person, and then save, right? Just pick one problem and just work on that and get really good at that and find something where you can like contribute, right?" I have a wildly unconventional route to being on a policy team. I can trace it back to like a specific moment. We used to do these city life stories where we would like open up a geofence over a certain city and just be like, what's going on in Rome or what's going on in Paris or something, and for Snapchat. And we were going to do one. I looked at the calendar and there was one coming up for Istanbul. And it just so happened to be like a day off from the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. And I was the one who was like, maybe not, right? Working with like, we're all in our 20s. Everybody's just like throwing stuff at the wall. And everybody was like, oh, Evan knows things that are on Wikipedia. Have him do the news stuff or whatever, right? And so like have him write the rules for what we can show or not show. And it just like went from there. And so put yourself in places where you're going to get to do interesting things. You're probably in this room doing policy stuff because at some point in your life you said, I have a conscience. I see problems in the world, right? And so like use that, be that person, cultivate that part of yourself. Like read poems, right? Like get familiar with how to appreciate art. Like do the things that AI is not going to take away from you. So that in whatever world we live in 5-10 years from now, you are still useful and still able to contribute and still able to solve problems.
I sound like everyone else, and I've had an unconventional way here, so there's no road mapping or planning, and I just wouldn't try. What I would say is, first, to me, there is no longer an AI expert. And I say that working under my direct boss is the godmother of AI, right? But I sit in a room with other people from different fields who are trying to be expert in this space as well. This is kind of a resounding thing that I've brought up a couple times. And someone will propose something, and then someone from the law school will sit there and say, "Well, yeah, but that's illegal, so you can't do that," right? And then someone else from the med school will chime in with something else, and so there is no AI expert in my view anymore, which means that you don't need to be an AI expert to be involved in this space. You just have to care and learn and be as informed as possible.
Here's the one thing that I'll tell you that's most important if you want to be in policy. You need to be a good translator. You need to be able to take complex information and make it available for people and meet them where they're at and explain it in a way. So we do something, actually, we created these, we'll have there'll be journal publications from some of our faculty. And we actually will take that journal article and distill it down and make it available to somebody. And I say it has to be available for somebody, for an 85-year-old senator to be able to read, because a lot of them are 85 years old right now, and you need to be able to meet them where they're at. So translating is very key, because you can have all the technical knowledge in the world, and if you can't get it out, that doesn't make a difference. And you can have a lot of policy knowledge, but if you can't explain that back to the technical people, they're not going to get that. So you have to be able to be a good storyteller, understand a simplistic way to get the main point that you want them to get, and understand that, and they can walk away with that. So translation is key in this field.